from just outside the Empire City at the crossroads to the northeast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whenever you are, this is your premier podcast for all things unknown, not media, and I'm your host, JP. Welcome to Not Media. I'm your host, JP. For episode 14, I have a very special guest on Not Media. Floyd Wills has a bachelor's of science degree in human development and holds certifications in hypnotherapy and linguistic psychology. His investigations into sacred sites and out-of-place artifacts have led him across the globe. He currently lives in Washington. Floyd is also the author of The Red-Haired Giants of Lovelock Cave and Other Ancient Mysteries. Welcome to Not Media, Floyd. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well. Thank you, JP. I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate your audience tuning in. And I think we're going to have a very fun and interesting conversation on red-haired giants and perhaps many other ancient mysteries. And we can go down many rabbit holes. So I'll let you be the guide, and you can pick a rabbit hole. We can go down it.
Cool. That's what we do here at Not Media. We go down rabbit holes because it seems like, per the name of Not Media, I got sick and tired of the regular media not going down rabbit holes, and like I've kind of have a mind likened to yours, where I like it. It stimulates my mind to think about things that could have been real or may have very well been real in the history of this planet, and currently going on today that are not being spoken about because of stigmas scientifically and stigmas socially. So definitely we can go down some rabbit holes. So we'll start off with a couple questions about you and your work. Just tell me a little bit about your upbringing and your interest in human history, and maybe some of the anomalies have you had growing up. Was there an interest in this? Like, for example, I give myself, when I did my first episode, I talked about how when I was in sixth grade, I did a book report on the Loch Ness Monster. So that goes way back to the age of I was 12, and I kind of fell out the loop. But like somehow I realized after I started this podcast, I'm like, wait, I've kind of always been like this. Even as far back as 12 years old, I've kind of been this guy like that has always been stimulated by like this sort of thing. So how about yourself? And as far as your research into human history and giants and dwarfs and other things.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I grew up in Portland, Oregon area, and I had one sister, an older sister, and probably since I was in middle school, I had a fascination with like Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, things like that. Back in my day, the television programs that dealt with those types of subjects were In Search Of, with the host was the late great Leonard Nimoy.
Okay.
He was a host, and they had all kinds of unexplained stuff, and that really piqued my interest. And I was a kid that would go to the library and look up books on UFOs, Loch Ness monsters, and whatever I could get my hands on. I would read about it. So I just had this fascination from a young age, and I was also into always fascinated with like legends and mythology and things of that nature. So from a very young age, I had a real deep curiosity in these types of subjects. And
very cool.
Probably when I was in my teens, I had a paranormal experience as well. My whole family did.
Oh.
And that kind of really shook my world a little bit. We had a close friend of the family. She passed away in our apartment. She had a seizure. She was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And not long after her passing, it was very sudden. We heard knockings all over the house, knockings on the wall, knockings on the front door. And we would go to the front door and there'd be no one there. We'd hear knockings on the windows and we'd look out, no one would be there. And this happened for several days after this incident. And my dad, he didn't believe in any kind of supernatural, paranormal, anything like that. But when this started to happen, and there'd be knocking on the front door, and we'd all be sitting there, and he'd get up, and there'd be no one there. I looked at his face. He was kind of had a tough guy mentality, but I saw some fear in his eyes.
Wow.
Like he couldn't figure out what was happening. And
yeah,
we had a next door neighbor, who was a next door neighbor couple. They were an older couple, very religious folks, and my mom told them about what was going on, and the wife offered to come over to the house and go through the house and read passages out of the Bible and
Oh,
sprinkle some holy water. So she shows up at our house and starts doing this, and I was probably, maybe 15 or 16, and I thought it was kind of strange.
whoa.
However, I'm kicking myself that I didn't stay the full time, but I ended up thinking, oh, this is weird.
Yeah.
And I left, but my sister stayed and witnessed this, and she relayed this to me, that this woman was speaking in another voice. She was reading passages out of the Bible and started speaking in another voice. Her voice tone changed, and she said, this is Patty, which is our friend that passed away. And she goes, I'm sorry to scare you guys. I didn't mean to do that. I just wanted to say goodbye, and I didn't have an opportunity to do that. And then so she,
Wow.
yeah,
That's
sprinkled holy
wild.
water. It's wild. And she left. She went through the house, sprinkled holy water,
Did
and
the
from that
lady
moment,
did
go ahead.
did after this event, did the lady remember that happening? Did she remember her body being taken over?
I don't, JP, I don't remember. I wish I would have, like I said, stuck around and got more details about that. So that's a good question. I do not know. However, after she did this, we never heard not another noise again, not another knocking
That
in the
is
house
so
again after that.
wild. Yeah, I mean, I had a good opportunity. If you can check out my episode 5, I interviewed.
Okay.
It was the author of the book, the Atheist in Heaven, Paul Davids, and he had an experience, and it was the first time I've ever heard of anything like this. It was a traced case with a paranormal slash ghost experience. Now, trace
Mm,
cases, because you've done some UFO research, you're probably familiar with the history of trace cases and how, like, sometimes there's a UFO sighting or a UFO lands and there's like evidence left over. There's like a trace left over, like a
yeah.
powder or like a mark in the
An
ground. Those are
outline or
typically,
something.
and there's thousands of those associated with UFO sightings. But when you talk about ghosts and paranormal, very
Mhm.
seldomly do we have traced cases. So, and I'm not going to get too much into that because I don't want to take us away from where we're at. But just
Yeah.
the long and short of it was, if you watch the episode, there was residue left over on a piece of paper from apparent
Interesting.
from an attempt. It looks like, for this gentleman, Forrest Ackerman, to communicate with Paul Davids, because he said, "Hey, I don't believe in God or heaven or whatever. I'm an atheist," and that's why the book is called "An Atheist in Heaven." But
Mhm.
if there's something after this, I will be sure to drop you a line. You'll be the first one to know. And it looks like he did.
Absolutely.
Forrest Ackerman did let Paul Davids know that there is something after this. So that's it. It's at some level, for you and I and the people listening, that's a relief, because we have so much fear. I believe we live in a fear-based society.
Yes.
And if you look at the media and the news, and I try not to do that here at Not Media, this is why I kind of got like sick and tired of the mainstream media. It's a fear-based, fear-mongering society. And because if you get people riled up, you can control them. If you get people riled up, you can get their interest. If you
Yes.
get people, for clicks, you want clickbait, or you want ratings, or you want to get people rallied around a cause. So I feel like between that and like Hollywood and the attempts at like filmmakers, and it's art, so they have every right to try to make a good piece of art. But I feel like a lot of times these topics that you and I discuss, they get thrown into the mainstream, and then the mainstream puts a negative
Mm.
spin on them, and it's very fear based. I feel
Mhm.
like in the Western world, death has that appeal because we're so used to, like, the things that captivate our imaginations, like the movies, like
Mhm.
E.T., which is a friendly movie, but then you have The Exorcist, and you have all these
Right.
other movies, all these horror movies, and we have like this whole genre of horror and paranormal, and
Mhm.
it's all has this negative spin. And I think in reality, most of these encounters are positive. So, it's almost like I work in the world of policing, and like everybody says, "Oh, look, the police are the problem, police are the problem." And it's like, if you look at the reality, you look at the actual numbers, like how many police officers are out there that are doing the right thing, that are showing up to work every
Right.
day, that are going above and beyond. That's the
Yeah.
overwhelming norm.
Yeah.
And it's the very small sliver of bad, or very small, that deviates from that. And it's the same thing, like there may have been some instances where there's been a strange paranormal experience, but like most of the times people have these experiences, they seem to be generally positive, where somebody's
Mhm.
maybe trying to communicate with them. So, it sounds like in your case, your dad was scared. And like, I've had one experience in my life, I'm not going to get into it, but like, it was similar to that. Like, something, I didn't understand something. And then I thought, I had a dream, and somebody who had passed away seemed like they had kind of given me a message. So it was like,
Mm.
um, I think these experiences are usually positive, and because of the way that a Western culture is, and Western media, and Western cinema, that we automatically
Mhm.
think, "Oh my God, I heard a knock," and they're like, "It has to be the devil. It has to be a demon." Meanwhile, it could
So
just be like,
true.
"Hey, when we leave this life, and our spirits leave this body, we go into another realm, and that realm is very accessible still here to this life, and like so many people are scared." If you were to come and approach them after you had passed, they'd be like, "Oh, is this like some sort of demon like trying to possess me or something?" Like people, so we fear the
Mhm.
unknown, and like I think we need
So true.
to do something to get over that. So, very cool story. Thank you for sharing that with me. During your
Yeah.
education with a bachelor's of science in human development, did you come across anything major that influenced your current research?
Well, I've always been fascinated not only with kind of the ancient mysteries of the world, like, the Egyptian civilization, some of these early civilizations, the pyramids, things like that, but that transferred over to mysteries of the mind and our subconscious. And there's
Okay.
so much about our mind that we still don't understand. And in my research in psychology, I kept running into references of the subconscious mind, and I learned more about how our subconscious mind works. And
Okay.
and by studying that, it led me into roads such as hypnosis and altered states of consciousness.
Oh, I saw that you have certifications in both hypnotherapy and neuro linguistic psychology. Is that does that kind
Neurolinguistic
of?
psychology is kind of the mixed martial arts of psychology. So it's a
Oh,
combination. Yeah, it's a combination of a number of different theoretical approaches put together, and being a martial artist like yourself, I kind of look at it that way: is that the founders back in the '70s, Bandler and Grinder were the two researchers that developed this. They studied a number of different theoretical approaches to therapy, and then they kind of combined some of the best elements of these different systems and put it together. And so, yeah, that's why I call it mixed martial arts of psychology.
very cool. I recently, last May of 2022, I got my bachelor's degree in psychology. I have a associate's in criminal justice, and then I have a bachelor's in psychology. So I know
That's
it's
awesome.
funny that we share similar paths. And
Yeah.
has that come into play with your research? Has those certifications? I know, like for example, let's just say in the paranormal world, we have I know Bud Hopkins, I believe, was doing hypnotherapy for people that claim to have missing time. So he wrote a famous book called Missing Time,
Hmm.
and who else was the? I know there was a couple names, but I think he was one of the big names, and especially he passed away, I think, within the past decade. But I know he was one of the big names with people who had missing time. Then they would get
Yeah,
hypnotherapy. Then during that hypnotherapy, one of the most famous cases is the Betty and Barney Hill case,
that's
where
right.
they went under hypnotherapy, and it was a
Yeah.
couple who had a trip through the mountains of New Hampshire, and then when they came back,
Hmm.
they realized that there was a chunk of time from their night missing, and then there was like physical traces left on
Yeah.
Betty's dress and the car. So like it all kind of came down to them doing these
Hmm.
hypnotherapy sessions, which revealed like that they were taken aboard a craft, and like a lot of times that's how they get these repressed regressive memories, through hypnotherapy.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I've never done anything like that as far as regression for anyone that's claimed to have been abducted. However, it is interesting because a friend of mine, his cousin, got a hold of me, and I know him not really well, but he sends me a text picture of a hand, and you could see an X-ray, and it looks like there's a little microchip right here in the web of the hand, and
Yes.
he says, "I have one of those." And so he
Wow.
sends me a picture of his hand, and there's like a little bump right in the same spot. And
Yeah.
I thought, and I yeah, and I'm like, and I text him back, and I'm like, Dale, like, what is up with this? And he goes, I gotta call you. I goes, can I call you? And I said, yeah. And
Yeah.
so he recently went in for an MRI for
Yes.
for something else. And when he was in the MRI, he felt something in that web of his hand that was wanting to come out of his body.
Yeah.
It was, and it was obviously it was some type of a metallic object.
Yes.
And he goes, Floyd, he goes, I don't ever remember like any piece of metal like being embedded in my hand. And he goes, in fact, when I got out of the MRI machine, he goes, I showed the guy that worked there. He goes, look at my hand. He goes, I don't ever remember having any kind of metal or anything in my body. And he looked at the guy and he goes, I'm wondering if this is, something else, referring to like, is it some type of like a chip that was put in there, which many people claim that they've been abducted. They've had some type of an object put in them.
Did
Roger Lear was a
Yes.
doctor. He passed away. He did a lot of extractions of these things,
Yes.
which was amazing because he said there was no inflammation
Yes.
around these foreign objects that were in these individuals. He said that's medically impossible.
Yes.
There
Yes.
should have been inflammation, and there's not. And in one particular case, he sent the piece of object that was in this person that claimed they were abducted to NASA, didn't tell him where it came from. NASA came back, they did an analysis and said it was a piece of meteorite.
Yes. Yes. Meteoric.
So how in the heck
Yep.
do you
Yep.
get a piece of meteorite in your body and you don't have any, number one, how did that even happen?
Yeah.
And number two, there was no inflammation around where that object was, which
Yes.
is medically impossible.
Yes. 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 I actually, believe it or not, I went to that citizens hearing on Washington. I knew at the time I had done a fundraiser one time. I auctioned off a guitar for Stephen Bassett, and that was for his Paradigm Research Group. So he had saved a seat for me at that when there was that hearing. It was like a 5-day hearing down in Washington in 2013.
Uh-huh.
And
I remember hearing about that.
and a friend of mine and I were down there, and we're at the it was like at some complex, like a hotel complex. So we're getting something to eat down at there's like a restaurant, like the first floor, second floor, or whatever. And we're sitting there in the restaurant, and my buddy, I guess, just has like a really like common face or something that like everybody's. He says this happens a lot to me. Like people like, hey, do I know you from somewhere? And he said he just has one of those faces where he gets that a lot.
Yeah.
So, but believe it or not, somebody, as we're eating, somebody stops and we go up to the buffet, and a guy stops him and he goes, hey, do I know you from somewhere? And I'm standing right next to him. And the guy starts talking to me. He's like, I don't think so. And they're like kind of like looking at each other. Then I look down at the guy's name tag, and it's Roger Lear. And
oh my goodness.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow.
And I was a researcher at that time. I got involved in this whole field of UFO research, which is what originally kicked me off into this world of the unknown. Again, as an adult, minus me being a 12-year-old and doing that book report, as an adult, getting back into the field. One of the first cases, I remember getting a book. It was written by Roger Lear. And one of my first episodes on Not Media was the Varginha, Varginha, UFO crash of 1996, and I did a very, very extensive, in-depth talk about it. He wrote a book on that, and when I read Roger Lear's book at the time, that's what sparked my interest of that UFO crash. And he actually flew out there in 2003. This crash happened in the 1990s, and there was a. I even talk about it in my first episode. There was a New York Times article written, and it was very like disparaging. It was almost like half joking, half disparaging, like cue the X-Files music, like kind of just like dumping water on the whole thing, like, well, like these half-bit researchers down there, you know how they are. Like it had this very like a condescending attitude towards the whole thing, and it was the only article I could find here in the United States that was written. And it's this very complicated real event that occurred, and it just goes to show how much the media is duped and controlled, and and funded by corporate sources and funded by defense sources. It just goes to show, like, again, and it was Roger Lear who was out there 2002. He took a 3-month trip down there and interviewed all these witnesses, and he wrote a book. And like I said, so when I saw him in 2013, I had already read the book, and I asked him, I said, you're not the same Roger Lear who flew down to Brazil and did that? He goes, I am. He goes, it was fascinating. And I go, very cool. I go, very nice to meet you. And it was just like, whoa. I was like, the fact we randomly kind of came across each other on that. And then I heard he passed away within like a year, and I was like so sad. And I was like, that was a very cool, like, anecdotal story that I had, that like we randomly just met him at like a buffet at a hotel during that event. But anyhow, and I got his DVDs, so I've watched his DVDs. I'm very clued into the meteoric magnetite. I'm very clued into the osteocells, which are bone cells, which
Mhm.
grew around the implants, which is
Mhm.
unexplainable, which would shield them
Mm.
from the immune system because the body would
Ah,
recognize them as part of the body and not some foreign object.
interesting.
And I'm also very familiar with the fact that when you touch something, you have nerve centers called proprioceptors or proprioceptors. I forget what
Mhm.
the name is, but there's something either one of those. But
Mhm.
they're basically like hot, cold, pressure, no pressure. Those are the
Mhm.
nerves that feel that on your skin.
Mm.
They noticed that these nerves were growing in to the implants, almost like.
Incredible.
And I was questioning at the time, was it because these implants were using the low voltage power source of the nervous system, or were these
Mm.
implants getting their way into our sensor cells and using that pathway to obtain and glean other information? So when
Wow.
so when Roger Lear
Fascinating.
would hold a and I actually bought one of these meters in case I ever come across something strange. It's like an art. It's like a it's a multimeter, but
Mhm.
it does magnetic waves, it does radio waves, and I think there was one more
Mm.
voltage. So it gives you
Mm.
like three different spectrums of like how you can measure energy. And when
Mhm.
they would hold one of these type of meters over the implant, whatever
Mm.
this implant was bleeding. I think it was AM radio waves. And
Wow.
Roger Lear's theory was that it probably wasn't bleeding like a signal in AM radio. He
Mhm.
suspected this was probably like a bleed over of some other type of energy that these things were emitting. So
Hmm.
somebody somewhere out there potentially has some sort of a receiver that is could say fly within the area and receive whatever these signals were that were coming out of these small devices that had carbon nanotubules when they were actually able to cut one open, and they were very peculiar devices. And considering at the time humanity is really only able to have the technology to like view these objects and know they exist and not really create them on any like workable level where they're
Right.
like in functional equipment the size of a tip of a graphite pencil. It just kind of leads you to believe that something more is going on here. So very cool. So we kind of went into that. And tell me a little bit about in your book, um,
Mhm.
the red-haired giants of Lovelock Cave and other
Mm.
ancient mysteries. At the intro, you spoke about how as an adult,
Mhm.
this passion for this type of research was renewed, and the person that you give credit to was a Jim Vieira and Bill Vieira,
Yeah.
who was his brother, and
Mhm.
they were looking at New England colonial. You had put them in quotes root cellars, and somehow
Yeah.
these root cellars sparked your interest and said something's going on here. Now, just maybe just give like for a minute or two, just tell us about these root cellars, what they were, what you think they were. What exactly are these structures? Are they believed to be built by giants? And
Yeah.
you know, uh, and then you had one into something about them finding like skulls with double rows of teeth. We can get more into
Yeah.
that, but I know like somehow you
Absolutely.
associate them with these root cellars. So if you want to talk about that for a minute or two.
Yeah, fantastic question. Yeah, it was a presentation I saw from Jim Vieira about 8 years ago. And he ended up doing, him and his brother ended up doing a series on the History Channel called, I think it was In Search of the Lost Giants. I don't know if you're familiar with that or you saw any episodes,
Hmm.
but it was, they did have some episodes on there in investigation into these strange skeletons. And how they got into it was they would get out hiking in the woods in the New England area, and they would find these very strange structures, stone structures, and they're both stonemasons by trade. And so they were able to really look at some of these structures, and they weren't gigantic structures, as if they were, megalithic or anything like that, but they were very unusual, and they almost looked very European, like ancient European.
Yeah.
And so they started doing more research and like looking at the old county records in these areas where some of these strange structures were found.
Yeah.
And then they started coming across references, old newspaper articles of giant skeletons being found around these particular areas.
Oh
And
wow.
so they kind of stumbled into it was by investigating these structures. And when they were looking at the historical records, The historians would say, oh, these were just old colonial root cellars. That's all these things are. They're not any more ancient than that. However, there was no evidence that there were any doors ever used at these places, which is silly. Why would you build a root cellar in the middle of the woods and not put any kind of door or anything? And all
Huh.
the critters of the forest would simply go in and have access to whatever you're putting in there. So that
Yes.
didn't quite make sense. And so they stumbled upon the whole giant skeletons through their research into these unusual structures. And I think there's a whole backstory to those structures. I think my personal opinion, and based upon my research, is that some of these structures were pre-Columbian in nature, and they were built by peoples that came here to North America, hundreds, if not thousands, of years before Columbus.
Oh wow.
I believe there's evidence that there were ancient Celtic people that came here,
Okay.
Phoenicians,
Yes.
Egyptians. A
Yes.
number of these ancient civilizations were here long before Columbus. And I read about this, decades ago. There was a researcher named Barry Fell.
Okay.
He was very popular back in the 70s and 80s. He was an expert in ancient languages and symbols, a very educated man. And he would go around to all these unusual sites, like in New England and other places, and look at these structures and
Yeah.
look at carvings on cave walls and things like that. And he determined, like, yeah, these are Celtic. This is evidence ancient Celtic people came here,
Okay.
Phoenician people came here, and so I believe some of those structures, those stone structures, tie back to some of these ancient civilizations long
Got it.
before Columbus.
So you and
And
oh, I was going to say, so from your research, there was not only just these root cellars, there was also some sort of symbolism or artifacts that were not
yeah,
associated with the common people that habitated per classical history this area. Like you said, symbols of Celtic and symbols of, and this.
absolutely,
Wow.
absolutely, JP. In fact, about 3 or 4 months ago, I was visiting my sister in Kansas, and I've done some research on a site in the Oklahoma Panhandle called Anubis Cave.
Okay.
Anubis is the Egyptian god of the dead, and Anubis is often depicted as having like a dog head, like a
Yes.
jackal head.
Yes.
Yeah, and associated with the dead. At any rate, of many years ago, I heard about this cave in the Oklahoma Panhandle that had these ancient symbols in the cave. Anubis being one of them. There were other Egyptian symbols, and anyway, so these symbols were lined up to the equinoxes. So twice a year, at certain times, the rays of the sun would shine into the cave, and it would hit like the Anubis symbol and other
Very
certain
cool.
symbols in the cave. And I thought, man, I want to go take a look at this place. So unfortunately, I was blessed. I got a hold of someone that could take me to the cave. Because it's on private property, and I
Okay.
went out there with a childhood buddy I've known since I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and he's been interested in archaeology, and he goes out and finds a lot of Native American artifacts and whatnot in his area. So he
Cool.
came with me, and we went to the cave and saw these old inscriptions, and it was just phenomenal. And there's been actually a lot of research by a number of archaeologists that have researched the cave, and they believe, or at least some believe, that these were ancient peoples that were here thousands of years ago. And they not only had the symbols in there, but they knew about, like, they knew about astronomy. How
Wow.
on the equinoxes, the light shining through the cave, it would hit certain symbols at certain times of the year.
Yes.
So yeah,
Yes.
I totally believe. Yeah, there's been many ancient cultures that have been here before.
Very cool. They have this in-depth knowledge of science and astronomy, which goes to show, like per the record of that, like you said, pre-Columbian, that it was Columbus that came here first, and then as far as any sort of settlers from Europe or anything, east from the Atlantic, happened there during that time period, which would be the late 1400s, and then so on before the settlers came here, and then the Dutch settlers and such, and the Pilgrims and such. So, as far as there's a famous quote. I know I've heard it before. It is that it's something to the effect of like, it is those that conquer that are the ones that tell the story. So it's like basically like the people that win, like, whoever. So I'm sure if you go to a country that like won a war, like they're going to
Yeah.
give their spin on what like what the war is. And you even
Hmm.
see that on to this day when you see like
Yeah.
other countries. Like for example, I know this is like a big controversy over in what was it in China, and they had this protest, this famous protest. I think it was like in the I don't know if it was in the 80s, Tiananmen Square. And there's this
Square.
famous
Yeah.
photo of this man who stood in front of a tank
I
and like
remember that. Yes.
challenge, and like it's almost like people get together and like celebrate like that protest, and they like because it was like this landmark of like people standing up against like the communist regime at the time or whatever,
Hmm.
and they'll go to jail for it. They're like, no, like that never happened. Like they almost like they scrub that, like they go on the internet and they scrub these events from happening. So we see it up until this day. So for whatever reason, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, why we would have this push here, and I think you're going to get into that a little bit more, maybe through the Smithsonian, maybe
Hmm.
represented by our government. That would be like the Smithsonian might be like a government funded organization. Why there would be this big push to withhold this information instead of like embracing it and saying, "Oh wow, this is something interesting about this world." And like maybe I'm not sure. Like I can give you a straight answer, or if you can give me a straight answer, but um, I think we'll get into your book first. But it's probably a multi-headed answer to a complicated question, like why is
Hmm.
it that this information will be withheld. So well, it's like I don't know, like is it science, is it culture, is it control, is it the narrative that gives us our national pride to say like, hey, this is the
Yeah.
history that we teach our children. It's very
Mm.
straight, it's very in line, it gives you an
Hmm.
idea of how America came about, why we are who we are today, why you need to
Yeah.
salute the flag. And once we start pulling the carpet out from that foundation, we start
Hmm.
to rattle that house. You know what I'm saying? So maybe it might be like
Yeah.
like a multi-pronged
It's absolutely
reason for
very,
why, you know.
yeah.
Instead of this grand
Very
conspiracy,
eloquently
you know.
said.
What's that?
Yep, very eloquently said, JP. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a number of different things. Now, the Smithsonian Institution was founded in the 1800s, about mid 1800s, and from the time of the founding, what was taught is that any artifacts, any remains that were found in North America, um, they had to have come from the native peoples, pre Columbian. They couldn't. They were taught. All the archaeologists were taught that it couldn't have come from any other ancient civilization. It's
Yeah,
either the native peoples here, if it was pre-Columbian, and it can't be anything else. So from the very get-go, they kind of laid down that foundation that this is how it is,
yeah.
and anything else that contradicts that um, is not true.
So it's not
So
possible. It's very hard for
it's
them to
not
think outside that
possible.
box. Like
It's
they
not
get
possible to think outside of the box.
yeah, they
Exactly.
get trained in that box, and it's almost like the
Mhm.
same way with the media. They're very much in this box, and it's almost like there was this famous Saturday Night Live skit where I know Will Ferrell was one of the people on there, and it was a news outlet. They were giving a like a news report, and the teleprompter went down. And like they showed like 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, and like the whole studio quickly degraded into a Lord of the Flies type situation where like they were burning the couch, and he's like eating a chicken wing, and he's like, oh, like screaming in the air. Like this is what happens. Like these guys have a script and they have a teleprompter. If you take that away, as far as the thought, like the critical thinking that goes into a lot of these like stories, like it falls
Yeah.
by the wayside. So it's good that people like yourself are out there doing this. Let's jump it into your book, the Red
Hmm.
Haired Giants of Lovelock Cave. I'm going to kind of just, like I said, I took extensive notes here, and I'm going to kind of just scan through them
Yeah.
and kind of just maybe
Sure.
start throwing stuff at you. So, you talk about in your book, you gave a quote from Francis Collins about science and the supernatural
Hmm.
illuminating each other and how they were investigated in different ways, like science and supernatural. And it's like,
Hmm.
maybe people like yourself obviously aren't getting the credit they deserve, because even though you have science, you have supernatural. Sometimes you can't, like with the ghost, for example, like UFO activity or ghost activity. Sometimes you can't. You just have to be an observer, and there's different ways
Yes.
to access this information, and you can't necessarily shake it inside of a test tube. Once in a while maybe, but not all the time. So just to say, because
Right.
you can't put it in a test tube and shake it around, or put it in a studio somewhere and do a double blind experiment, doesn't mean that it's not real. So, like, maybe we
That's
just need
right.
to start stepping our game up. And the Aztecs were conquered by the Spaniards. So going back into the time of the defeat of the Aztecs,
Mhm.
I know you had even drawn a picture of one of the Aztecs. It seems like you have some artistic skills. I
A
thought that
little bit.
they were very nice. Um,
Yeah.
and you start getting into these red-haired giants.
Hmm.
And is this pronounced correctly? The Piautes?
Oh, that it's the Paiutes.
Oh, the Paiutes. Okay,
The
so
Paiute
the
tribe.
Paiutes,
Yes.
yeah. So the Paiutes and their leader Tocho speak about a final battle with these red-haired giants. In 1911, you had John Reed and David Pooh found an
Hmm.
arrow stuck into the cracks of Lovelock Cave, and now this is
Hmm.
what Lovelock Cave is, Arizona. Where is this
It's
held?
in Nevada.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh, oh,
it's in Nevada. Yep,
Nevada.
it's a
Okay.
cave in Nevada, and the Paiute tribes, the local indigenous people in that area, in their oral traditions, talk about these red-haired giants, and they call them different names. One of them's known as a Sitika, and
Okay.
which means tule eaters, and tule is like a water plant, and in that
Yes.
particular area there used to be a large lake, and it used to be much more marshy in that area. Now it's all dried up and desert like, but going back hundreds, thousands of years, there was this giant lake, and allegedly there was this tribe of these red-haired giants, and they were also known as the people eaters too. They were
Yes.
very violent. They attacked neighboring tribes, and they would cannibalize their victims.
Wow.
And so, yeah, finally the Paiutes got tired of being attacked, and they allied with a number of local tribes, and they waged war on these giants that lasted over 3 years, which finally culminated in a final battle at the Lovelock Cave, where they cornered the last of the giants there, and they threw brush in front of the cave, and they lit flaming arrows and basically burnt the giants to death.
Wow. And there was looks like the University of California. There were some giant bones found there, and there was also some arrowheads, and one of the local chiefs, Winnemucca, warned that
Winnemucca.
Winnemucca warned that there was evil spirits in that place, and they found in that cave. It was supposed that they found a 6 foot giant with red hair. In that cave, and the bones were sent to the University of California, or did anybody follow up on that? Oh, it was also said that the bones were maybe destroyed by a local fraternal lodge, and you had looked into
Okay.
that. I know in a
Yeah,
section of your
JP,
book.
this gets very interesting because one of the first uh, excavations on that cave occurred in, well, the first discovery was made 1911. The first official excavation occurred in 1912. And what was interesting is they said there was a lot of skeletal remains, mummies that came out of there, thousands and thousands of artifacts, which were
Yep.
distributed to a number of different museums. However, all the skeletal remains disappeared out of the public view. However, there is a reference in that first excavation that basically said the largest of the mummies was actually given to a local fraternal lodge to be boiled and used in initiation purposes, which really blew my mind. I'm like,
That's
what the
strange.
heck is this?
That's super strange.
They're not even letting the public see these skeletal remains that came out, and yet they're saying they gave one of the largest ones to a local fraternal lodge to be used in initiation purposes, which I thought was completely bizarre. So
Yeah.
the skeletons disappear. However, there was a museum in that area, Humboldt Museum, that allegedly obtained some of the skulls that came out of the cave, and they kept them in the basement. They
Yes.
never put them on public display, and if you wanted to see them, you had to ask the curator, and they would take you down to the basement, and they kept them in these cupboards.
Yes.
And they were there for decades and decades until they were removed, probably within the past 10 to 15 years ago, and repatriated back to the native tribes. There was a law in the 90s called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which basically said, if these museums have any of these Native American remains, they need to give them back to the tribes.
Okay.
So that's what I was told when I inquired to go look at the skulls. They said, "Oh, we no longer have them here. They were given back to the tribes." And I felt I was getting a kind of the runaround, JP, when I was communicating with one of the curators there, and
Yes.
they said, "Oh," I said, "Well, why were they never put on public display?" And they said, "Well, because in this political climate, we would lose our funding if they were put on public display." However, these skulls had been there at that museum for 40, 50 years, like long before, like all of the political
Hmm.
correctness, long before NAGPRA and everything like that. And they were never put on public display. So I thought that's kind of a weird answer.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
I
can
was going to
understand
ask you about
it.
that because that was actually part of
Yeah.
my notes. There was some time discrepancy. You said it was 1990 when this NAGPRA Act
Yeah.
was what was initiated. So you said, well,
Mhm.
if this NAGPRA Act, what, like, what was the nature and what was the disposition of these skulls before the NAGPRA Act? Why weren't they?
That's
Now,
right.
I mean, at the time, I could see that being maybe something you'd think of after the fact, like, huh, like I didn't think of that
Yes.
at the time. Were you able to actually draw the connection and ask the curator that, like, right there, then on the spot, and say, hey, like, if you guys didn't have that act until 1990, then why, from when were the bones first discovered, 1912 or whatever, like all these decades before,
Yeah.
why weren't they put on display before? So something gives me the feeling that it wasn't just this NAGPRA Act that led you not to put these bones on display. Maybe there was some sort of larger power at play or larger pressure at play, and that
Precisely.
and then they're just using this act almost like, well, maybe an easy way for us to get rid of these. I mean, like, that's like, I can't prove that this way or that, because I do
Yeah.
understand how, Native Americans were given reservation land over the decades. And like, there was this,
Mhm.
I guess you could consider that like reparations for like the
Yeah.
injustices that were done to them from European settlers. So I can't
Mhm.
like argue with like the thinking behind like, hey, if you find any artifacts from Native Americans, they're not to be displayed in museums because effectively Europeans came here and took this country from the Native Americans, so at least we could give them their artifacts and their history back, so they can do
Sure.
with it what they want. So just a follow up before we move on into
Mhm.
anything else.
Mhm.
Were you ever able to contact any of these Native American tribes and see if they would speak with you, or was this like off limits to be able to try to hunt down any of this information?
Yeah, I couldn't get any information from the native tribes. However, I did reference some elders of one particular elder, Native American elder, and he actually spoke about the oral tradition of the red-haired giants,
Okay.
and basically confirming that not only amongst the Paiutes, but there were other native tribes. His name was Clifford Mahudi, and he just passed away here a few years ago.
Okay.
But he basically confirmed the story that yes, there were these giants, these red-haired giants, and oftentimes they fought with the native peoples, and he said that it was believed they lived in the underground. And now going
Oh,
back to the Lovelock Cave with the remains, where did they go? I did manage to obtain some photographs of the skulls that were housed there before they were given back to the Native American tribes, if
okay.
that's where they went. If
Yeah.
indeed that's where they went. That's what I was told.
Yeah.
And one of the skulls I have pictured in my book, and it's a massive skull, gigantic.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about it is that it still has a patch of red hair attached
Wow.
to the skull. And not only that, in the upper row of teeth, it has looks like almost a double row of teeth, and
Double
you
row
will
of
hear
teeth.
double row of teeth, and I actually found a couple newspaper articles, old newspaper articles, going back to the early 1900s that seem to confirm the discovery of that particular skull at the museum. It was found
Okay.
on a ranch that was actually near that area, near the cave. And what's interesting is I kept coming across when I would find these old newspaper articles on these discoveries, and I was accumulating lots of them, just
Yes.
subscribing to old newspaper databases and that type of thing. And in some references, they would say there was double rows of teeth, and
Yes.
I even as specific as saying it was the upper row that had the double set. And I thought that is just very unusual feature. And then I remember in the Bible it talks about, of course, we know of, most people have heard the story of David and Goliath
Yes.
in the Bible.
Correct.
You have this man against this giant.
Was he a
Well,
Philistine?
he was a mercenary for the Philistines.
Okay, so he wasn't a
Actually,
Philistine.
no,
So
in the Bible it
he
says
was a
that he
paid
was.
soldier.
Yeah, he was descendant of the Nephilim. It says
Nephilim.
it in the Bible, and the
Oh,
Nephilim are the giants. They're
yes.
Nephilim is a Proto-Hebrew word meaning fallen ones, and
Yeah.
so I believe that Goliath was actually a mercenary
Yeah.
fighting under the Philistines, and he had brothers too, and a lot of people don't know that. And later on in the Bible, it talks about after Goliath had been defeated, how King David and his mighty men were fighting Goliath's brothers and killing them. And one
Yes.
of them referenced in particular had a double set of teeth. It
And
says in the
six fingers,
Bible,
right?
6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on
Six
each
toes in
foot.
each.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought you had made a reference in your book that there was a reference to when Noah built his ark that he took one of the giants on. Was it
Yeah.
Goliath?
No, it was that is King
Oh,
Og of
right.
Bashan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
King Og. Yeah, in the
Oh,
in the, in the yeah, in the Talmud text, it talks about how during the flood that King Og basically jumped
oh,
on the ark and was
yes.
hanging on and
He was a
basically
Nephilim.
begging Noah, saying, "Hey, let me stay on the ark, and I'll be your servant.
Yes.
I'll be your servant." And so you have all these different stories, like that. In Genesis 6 in the Bible, and I'll just paraphrase it. It said there were giants on the earth in those days and thereafter. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore them children, and they became mighty men of renown. And I think that little passage in the Bible, there's so much to that. There's
Yeah.
so much to unpack on that. Okay, first off, it talks about, well, there were giants in the earth in those days and thereafter. Well, giants, what giants are they talking about? And how
Yeah.
the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Well, who were the sons of God? And
Yeah.
so I kind of, in my book, I get into who are the sons of God. And if you go through the Bible, a number of times the sons of God are referenced in Job. It talks about how the sons of God with Lucifer came before the throne of God. And
Yes.
I'm sorry, but those sons of God that accompanied Lucifer to the throne of the Lord, they weren't human beings. They were celestial beings. Those weren't just humans walking with Lucifer in the celestial realms to approach the throne of the Lord. And
Yes.
then later on in Job, it talks about how the sons of God shouted for joy at the laying of the foundations of the earth. Well, then again, it's like no humankind was around at the laying of the foundations of the earth.
Yeah.
It's referencing the sons of God shouted for joy.
Yeah.
The sons of God, they were celestial beings.
Yes.
They were angelic beings, and in
Yes.
fact, there were books that were left out of the Bible. The book of Enoch being one of them, which is particularly interesting book, and it directly relates to all of my research on the giants. That I believe tells the complete backstory of that little passage of Genesis 6:4. It
Yeah.
gets into the story. Who were the sons of God? Who
Yeah.
were the giants?
Yes.
What happened? What led up to the great flood? And
Okay.
did giants survive? Did they live after the flood? And they did. And in Genesis 6, it kind of hints at that, where it says there were giants in the earth in those days, which means pre-flood and thereafter. And I
Okay.
believe there were some giants that did survive the great deluge, the great cataclysm,
Yes.
and but their bloodline became diluted, and that's why you have mentions of Goliath in the Bible that came later. He was of that descendant.
Okay.
Although his bloodline was diluted in the Bible, it referenced him as being like 9 feet tall. And
Yeah.
then you have Og of Bashan, another giant in the Bible. He was a giant. He had a bed that was like 13 feet long by like 6 feet wide, and
Yes.
it was made of iron. It was
Yes.
made of iron to support his frame. So we do have references going back to
That's
not only
huge.
the Bible, yeah, not only the Bible of these giants, but even going further back to the ancient Sumerian civilization that goes way, way back, 5,000 years ago, that
Yeah.
talk about the Anunnaki, those from whom heaven to earth came. And you'll see depictions on these clay tablets and on walls and whatnot of the ancient Sumerian civilization of these giants, and they believed these Anunnaki came from the skies, and they gave their civilization all the knowledge that they needed to start their civilization.
Yeah.
And you'll see depictions of them like sitting on a throne, and you'll see the servant standing up before them, and the king that's sitting on the throne is just as tall seated as the person standing before them. So if they stood up, they would be twice the size.
Wow. Yeah.
Excuse me.
So there's definitely some more than just speculation that whoever these Anunnaki were huge people or huge beings. We don't know if they were necessarily people. So, and back to what you were saying before, you had spoke about hyperdontism and supernumerary teeth, where you have a bifurcation or a trifurcation of the molars or the roots at the apex. These were some of the anomalies you were seeing, and I did read your book. I think that skull that you had referenced was the Don Monroe photograph of the skull, that giant skull. It seemed like it was
Yes.
damn near twice. If you took my skull, it'd be like twice the size or two or three times the size of my skull. It was huge. So you have to
Huge.
imagine, like what did the body look like on a head that big? To kind of balance that body out with a head, you would need somebody to be standing 8.5, 10 feet tall to make sense of that huge skull, because it really was that big. And there was also talk in your book of a group called the Denisovans,
Denisovans.
and how they had the largest molar ever found possibly came from them. And there was the Heidel Burgenese and the Denisovans, maybe some sort of a hybrid that these, if you're looking as far as what you could trace it back to, as far as your knowledge, minus the biblical text.
Hmm.
There was things going on where you found mastodon bones with spiral cracks on them near San Diego, and anthropologist Gene Hattori found a giant pestles near a cave. And let's see what there were some other things here.
Yes.
1940, there was a giant skull on Earth near Victoria, Texas. Maurice skull was the name of that.
That was
And
huge skull. And in fact, that's an interesting that you brought that up, because when I looked at the picture of that skull that was found in Texas in the newspaper article, and it's hard to find like photos of these skulls, very, very
yeah,
difficult. But in that particular article, I saw that a picture of that skull, and I compared it to the other skull you referenced. Don Monroe took that photo, and I did a side by side comparison, and they look like they can be of the same species, very
yeah,
similar
I
to
saw
each.
that in your book. The cheekbones were very similar.
Yes.
If you had to compare the structure of the skull, like if you told me, like, hey, this are two skulls of two family members or two cousins or a brother and a
Hmm.
sister or a brother and a brother, I'd say I could see that. I could see the size of the skull being similar, the structure, the way that the jaw, the way that where the
Massive
cheekbones
jaw.
sat. Yeah,
Hmm.
it was very different looking than the normal human skull. But these two skulls looked very similar. I think that was very you could determine that just from looking at a picture of these skulls, and you did put that in your book.
And
Um,
that disappeared too, JP. That skull out of Texas, that was
yeah,
never really put on public display.
disappeared, huh?
It
Wow.
disappeared, yeah. And then the university, I found an article where a researcher contacted someone there at the University of Texas and said, hey, do you guys still have this skull? What happened to it? And they basically said, oh yeah, it's not missing. We have the skull. Yeah, it was never put on public display. And oh, by the way, it's not giant either. That was just a poor reconstruction job
Ah,
by the archaeologist, which is ridiculous because if you see the original photograph in that newspaper article, it's a massive skull. And what this person is trying to say is that, oh, it's big because the person that was doing the reconstruction job added a bunch of stuff to it, made it look giant. I mean, it was
okay.
so ridiculous. I was like, that is just
Yeah, whatever they could do,
unbelievable.
whatever they could do to try to keep their narrative. Sometimes people have their narrative, and
Yes.
once they have that narrative, they're not going to be able to see outside that box. They're going to say, whatever I have to do to keep my narrative rolling here is what I'm going to do, and you're not going to change my mind. So it could have been. It sounds like it's something very similar to just that. Yeah, and she was trying to. It looked like you even cited somebody, osteologist Stacy Drake, and was like, not outside the normal range. Well, you're like, well,
Yes.
the normal range was huge. So if the
Yeah.
normal range is excessively big,
Mhm.
you're comparing it to that. So let's say the normal range was 7.5 feet. That's not
Right.
the normal range now for a normal person. So if the normal
Yes.
range of people there was 7.5 feet, we're already talking about extremely big people. So if someone could be like in the world of 7.5 people, like just how in the world of 5.5 foot people, like right now, like the average probably if you go across the world, like the average
Yeah.
person is probably somewhere in the ballpark of 5.5 feet tall, like
Mhm.
just all across the planet, like something like that. I mean, I'm just taking a guess, but
Yeah.
it's it's got to be something close to that. But yet some people are 7 or 8 feet tall. So imagine if the average person of this group was 7.5, 8 feet tall. What would be a tall person for them? 8, 10,
Precisely.
9, 11 feet tall, So probably maybe at some point wouldn't be uncommon for in this group of people for there to be a excessively large person who was from a excessively large group of people who could be, for us it would be a giant to have somebody. I don't think I was looking through the history when I read this book, the history of people on this planet. I think the
Mhm.
tallest person that there ever was suffering from some sort of a thyroid.
Was it gigantism?
Yeah, and I think they got to like what was it, 8 foot, something like 8 foot, like 9 or something like that.
Yeah.
But it was
Yes,
tall.
I
But
think that's John. I believe it was Woodrow. I could be wrong,
okay,
but
and
yes,
he had
he
passed
was.
away. I looked into that. He had to have leg braces because he was so big. So it's almost like we're not structurally sound to be that big. Us, like you and
Right.
I, the way that our bodies are built, it's not like if we were 8 or 9 feet tall, we would start having like physical problems because the way that our bodies are built aren't really constructed to hold that kind of frame. And I even it's funny that like we can get into this maybe a little bit in a little bit, but we even had like a strange down by the Nazca lines. What was that? Is that Atacama, Peru? They found some sort of a mummy, and you were saying that like it had 3 fingers and it had big eyes. This is something like not necessarily a giant, but just some sort of like anomaly, like reptoid type of
Yeah.
object. And you said like they were trying to say, well, it could have just been like some type of person or some type of birth defect. And you're like, the Achilles tendon
Looking that up here.
was the Achilles tendon was not even connected in the same way that our Achilles tendon is connected in a human being. So once you could start like pulling like structures or Achilles tendons and saying that there's like a different bone structure or a hole in the bone where the Achilles tendon goes, like that's a completely different body structure. And if it's by um, symmetrical, you could say, oh, if it was just some a sort of anomaly where it was just one leg, but like if you have it on both legs on both sides of the body, like that's
Right.
clearly not an anomaly. That's something that was like built into the structure of
Symmetrical.
some of these beings. Um, yeah, 27 shoe size. You guys found a sandal there. by
Yeah, in
Lovelock. They have
fact,
27.
this
I think
is
that's
really interesting, JP, because I actually got a photograph that I included in my book that was given to me by an anthropologist in Nevada. I had a dialogue with him. He seemed to be very open minded, and he provided me with some information on the red haired giants. And he sent me a photograph of a Thule sandal, which is
okay.
like this water plant that I had mentioned. It was woven into like a sandal that these people wore, and it was so big that he to display it he put it on an alleged Bigfoot print, and
Yes.
just to give it some size comparison, and put the sandal on that print. And I did the calculations to it, and it was this shoe size that was bigger than any that I was ever able to find, like on record, from any like professional basketball player. I couldn't find a bigger foot than that shoe size.
Yeah, you had compared it. You had compared it to Shaquille O'Neal, who had a size 21,
Yeah, and it
and
was
that
way bigger.
27, like 27 is way bigger than a 21. And
Yeah,
I like,
yeah,
even when I see, because I have a relatively small feet, I'm like approximately like a size 9 for a male. That's not that
mm,
big of a foot for a male. And
yeah,
sometimes I see somebody who has like a size like 11 or 12, and I'm like, whoa, you got big feet. And I'm like, but comparing a 21 to a 27, that would be like comparing me to like a size, like, what is that, 6 up? So that would be like me be comparing me to like a size 15 or 16. Like, that's a
right.
huge foot, like almost like
A huge,
staggering, like that big of a foot. So a size 27 is just like unreal. It's
it's
almost like,
unreal. And also a pestle was found, and I think you had mentioned this earlier, a giant pestle in that area. And Gene told me about it, and it was like a 35 to 45 pound pestle. And pestles,
unbelievable.
those giant, those stones that would use to, they would grind
Crushed
things
corn or
with.
something, or
Crushed
like
corn.
crush a.
Yeah, this thing's like 35 to like 45 pounds. And even in the article that I read, when the archaeologists found this, they said this thing is way
Yeah,
larger than a normal pestle. You
yeah,
don't need a 35 or 45 pound stone to like, pound corn or whatever it is you're
yeah.
grinding up.
No, yeah, that's excess. Like, you and I know you had mentioned somewhere in the book also there was a hatchet head that was 30 pounds. Like, there was a hatchet head found nearby, 30 pounds. And I was thinking in my head, I'm like, you know, I've spent some time. I do quite a bit of hiking, and I've
Yeah,
gone backpacking before. So I've spent, I wouldn't say I'm like the most versed outdoorsman, but I'm avid enough of an outdoorsman to know what it's like to swing a hatchet, to be out in the woods, and to
yeah,
cut a piece of wood out. And I would say for a guy my size, I mean, I'm approximately what, 5'9" and a half, 165 pounds. So I'm about average size. I wouldn't really feel comfortable if I had to like cut a piece of wood. If a hatchet head weighed more than, like, I don't know what, like 5 pounds, two
yeah,
and a half to 5 pounds, that would probably be a good size for a hatchet head for me. But if I had a hatchet head that was like 7.5 pounds, 10 pounds, that's pretty heavy, because you have to swing that a bunch of times, and like
yeah,
that's a lot of work. And a 30-pound hatchet, that's, it's like unwieldy, like, imagine picking up a 30-pound weight and doing, that's like almost like something you would do for like a military press. That's not something you'd be swinging
that's right.
like that. So it's almost like, for someone my structure, someone like, like an average male structure, a 30-pound hatchet head is almost unthinkable, because it's
Yeah,
not something that could be usable. It would be so unwieldy. It would be like formed to function. You need a little bit of weight to give you the power to swing, but like then
yes,
too much weight becomes to the point it's too much effort to actually swing
that's
it.
right.
You know. So you had mentioned that a Doctor F. Bruce Russell found remains of an 8 to 9 foot tall giant near a cave in Arizona, and he found the markings of a Masonic order. So you kind of got into that a little bit of your book. The bones were about 80,000 years old. They were found next to tiger and elephant bones. And Howard Hill stated some of the hieroglyphics bear a resemblance with those associated with the lost continent of Atlantis. You reached out to a number of different like orders, like the Rosicrucians,
Yeah,
uh,
Rosicrucians. Yep.
Rosicrucians at their Egyptian museum. So you looked into this. You went
Mhm.
into a little bit of like, was there some relation between the Masonic order, or the Knights Templar, um,
Yeah.
Order, Easter Star, Freemasons? Like what, like in what connection, may have you found?
Yeah, I do believe there's a firm connection because for example, the Freemasons, they claim that their knowledge goes back to the ancient mystery schools, and we're talking back to like even going as far back as ancient Egypt and their body of knowledge. And there's a gentleman who is a really great researcher named Gary Wayne. He wrote a book called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and he really goes in depth onto connecting organizations like the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians to these ancient Nephilim, these ancient giants. And I didn't so much go into a lot of depth in my book on that subject, but I do plan on writing a second book, a follow up
Oh,
book, and I want to go down that path a little more. But yes, I believe. So to go back to the Book of Enoch, the Book of Enoch talks about the story of a group of 200 of what are called watchers, which are basically angels that made a pact with each other. They found the women of the earth fair, and they were attracted to the women, and they wanted to, as the Bible said, go into them. And in
yeah,
the Bible, that means have sex.
yeah,
And so they made a pact. They knew what they were going to do was wrong and that there would be severe consequences, but they made that decision to do that.
yeah,
And so they interbred with the women. And not only was there an exchange of this, if you want to call it extraterrestrial DNA,
okay,
whether you want to call it, whether they were fallen angels or whether you want to call them ETs, if they weren't from the earth, technically they were, extraterrestrial beings, intermixing their DNA with the women of the earth. And not only did they do that, but they exchanged knowledge. They gave humankind knowledge we weren't supposed to have. And the Book of Enoch goes into that. And they
yeah,
taught us the arts of war. They taught us astronomy, astrology, herbalism, like all these different arts that I believe God didn't want us to have. And
okay,
we weren't ready for it, in this stage of
okay,
development, but they jumped the gun and
yeah,
gave us this technology. And so by this interbreeding, this intermixing of their DNA with the women of the earth, they created the Nephilim, the fallen ones, which are the giants. And the Book of Enoch talks about these giants were birthed and they started destroying the earth. They started killing off the humans. They started fighting amongst themselves. They were
yeah,
blood drinkers.
wow,
They were cannibals. They were just devastating the planet. In fact, I believe there is even references in the Book of Enoch of ancient genetic manipulation because it talks about how these beings were corrupting plant and animal life as well, which I
oh
thought was
wow,
interesting. I thought, man, this sounds like genetic engineering, and there's a reference in there how they were taking the seed of the of birds and mixing it with other animals. It
yeah,
just really struck to me like this sounds like some kind of genetic manipulation, genetic tinkering that was
yeah,
happening.
yeah,
And so, with this body of knowledge that they gave us, they were punished, and allegedly the great flood was brought upon the earth, not because mankind was just out of sin, but it was because things had gotten so bad that these Nephilim were corrupting everything and destroying everything. And so the Book of Enoch says the flood was brought to destroy them. And of
oh,
course, only one family supposedly made it through, and that was Noah and his family. And
yeah,
in the Bible, it says Noah was a righteous man and he was pure in his generation. And I believe where it said he was pure in his generation means he had a pure bloodline. The bloodline had not been tainted. So we're not just talking about he was a righteous man, but his bloodline was clean.
yeah.
It was clean. It was untainted. And
So,
so, oh, go ahead.
oh yeah, yeah. I was gonna say just some of that stuff that you were talking about makes me think about like, were we ready for that level of technology? Almost even like now today, there was a lot of talk from the UFO research of the Roswell incident and how the Department of Defense and the military got involved with back engineering that, and that
Mhm,
led to the birth of a lot of this computer age, microchips and
mhm,
Kevlar and laser technology and a lot of things. I mean, you know, walk into any major city nowadays and you're going to see everybody's face buried in a cell phone, and they're saying that the
Precisely.
roots the where, and like it's almost like you can ask the same question, because right now obviously mainstream media, mainstream academia is not acknowledging that this is a strong possibility of where the birth of a lot of this computer age came from, is from ideas that were seeded from some of these crash retrievals of UFOs, which is more than likely, from my research, a reality. But then begs the question, were we ready for this technology? Look at all the problems that this technology is causing. I mean, it's
Yes.
doing some good things, but there are some things that are bad from this technology. So there's like that dance of like good to bad, a ratio. I guess if great power is used in a responsible way, then it's for the betterment of humankind. But when great power is used to have this upcoming generation just make silly TikTok videos and like be mindless and follow propaganda that's not
Yes.
real about what's going on politically and what's going on scientifically, that's a negative thing. So it's like, it goes both ways. You mentioned the book of Enoch, and I wanted to ask you, the leader of the fallen angels,
The
Haza.
Semyaza? The
Uh,
Semyaza, yeah.
okay, he said, "Let us choose as wives from among the children of men and beget us children," which is what effectively what you said. They
Mhm.
defiled themselves.
Yep.
Do you believe they defiled themselves by having intercourse with women from this planet? Like, what was the word? Why was the word defiled used? And the fact that these giants, do you really believe that they possibly lived up to 500 years? I mean, it's hard to quantify that because we don't
Yeah.
know. This could have been a completely different race of people, so we don't really
Yeah.
know. Could they have lived up to, as some of these Indian texts that I was kind of looking into later on in your
Mhm.
book about the
Mhm.
Yugi cycles, and they stated
Mhm.
that there were different. Um, Let me see if I can come across any of this. There were different Yugi cycles, and those Yugi cycles showed that different stages of the enlightenment of humanity showed that people lived to different ages. Like
Yes.
in earlier times on this planet, people were actually, they were considered. Here we go. um, Golden ages. So, like the times
Yeah.
of Atlantis were considered golden age,
Mhm.
and there was the four different cycles: the Satya Yugi, Treta Yugi,
Mhm.
Dwapara Yugi, and the Kali
Mhm.
Yugi. And it was
Mhm.
like they even stated in their text that, let's say, for example, in the um, first stage that I had mentioned, and this is from ancient Indian text. It
Mhm.
looks like, so we're
Yes.
talking the first stage, the Satya Yugi. Humans were 21 cubits. That's 31 feet tall, and they lived
Yeah.
up to 100,000 years.
Yeah.
So that's what it states in their text. And you were saying
Yeah.
that like during the Cretaceous period, and I've thought about this also. I'm like, why were animals so big? Recently, I don't know if you saw this video. There was
Mm.
a skull found on the
Mm.
cliffs of England, and it
Mm.
was, I could send you a link after the fact, but it was of
Yeah.
a um, dinosaur that like kind of had like the head of a crocodile, and it
Mhm.
had flippers, almost kind of like like large flippers, almost either like a manatee or something. But it was a
Mhm.
huge animal. The skull was 2 meters long, and I was
Wow.
like, my God, this thing was scary. It looks like a monster. It looks like if there was
Mm.
a dragon, this thing would be
Mhm.
a dragon. And I'll actually send you a video of this, because
Oh, I'd love it. Yeah, I'd love to see
archaeologists
it.
spent an inordinate amount of time. And the reason why it's such a great find is because the
Mhm.
skull is almost complete. It's a little
Oh, that
lopsided
is
because the way they found it,
amazing.
and it's 2 meters long. So they said if the skull was 2 meters long, this thing must have been 60 feet long. It was one of the largest seafaring animals ever in the history of this planet. And
Wow.
like you were saying, 35% oxygen at the time could support these massive creatures, these massive dinosaurs. Now it's
Yes.
21%. So if the world climate changes, you're
Yep.
naturally going to get bigger living creatures. So like humans or
Yeah.
bipeds would have been the same. You have don't Didn't we have Australopithecus? Was that the name of the giant gorilla or the giant ape? This thing
Um,
was
yeah,
this.
like it's almost like a King Kong
Yeah,
size.
this thing was.
Yeah.
I heard it was like what, 3 meters tall. So that's what, 12, 13 feet tall. You have a giant gorilla that's 13 feet tall. That's a giant. So if they had gorillas, it's like it begs, was there some other species that were this big? So they lived 100,000. Then the next cycle, 14 cubits, 21 feet, and then the next cycle, that was a time of peace. Then which was the Treta Yuga, then the Dwarpa Yuga, the Age of Energy, 10.5 feet, and they lived 1,000 years. So that's about the size of the people that you're speaking of, correct? And
Mhm.
then we get into our age, which is the age of materialism, where people only live 100 years and they're only 5.5 feet. It's kind of like a dark age, which is
Yeah.
kind of depressing if you think about.
Yeah.
Hopefully, you and I are the people that bring the light to this dark age in the Yugi cycles from that would be like the Vedic or the
Yeah, Vedic, from the Vedic text. Yeah, it's
okay.
fascinating, JP, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I believe that the atmospheric conditions of the Earth in ancient times had to be so much different. Obviously, we have evidence of the giants, dinosaurs discoveries, and the one that you just referenced. Some of these animals were massive, that walked this earth, or that swam in the waters, or flew, and not only were these creatures so much bigger, but the plant life was bigger. The
Yeah.
flora and the fauna, everything was bigger. So the atmospheric conditions had to be different during those times that would support that larger life. And in fact, I reference an article in the book talking about, well, if we were to, clone a T Rex, could it survive in this environment? You
You were
know,
saying,
uh,
yeah, 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 yeah. You had
and
mentioned that.
it
You said the
wouldn't last
oxygen,
long. Yeah, it
it
wouldn't
couldn't
last.
breathe.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it would
It'd
be
be
like
like
you
if
or I
we
going up to.
top of the mountain of the Himalayan mountains. It wouldn't.
Yep.
You'd have a hard time breathing. It couldn't even be supported for very long.
You would get oxygen sickness, because I was actually
Yeah.
going to take one of the challenges I was going to take on, and this is actually, even though it's not that tall, my friend was telling me they actually have more deaths up at this mountain than they do some of the larger mountains you hear in the world. It's
Mm,
called Mount Washington, and I think it's
mm,
up around here on the East Coast. And we were going to go up
okay.
there and take a two, because he said what happens is people don't prepare properly. They think it's like, oh, just a day hike. They find
Yeah.
themselves up 9,600 feet, where you're going to have possibly altitude sickness start cutting in,
Yeah.
high winds. It could be like 50 degrees down here, but then you go up there and now it's wind blowing and it's 20 degrees out. You're going to freeze
Right.
to death. Like you're not going to
Yeah.
be able to be able to survive those sort of environments. So, but I believe he was saying something like 9,000 feet or 9,600 feet is when altitude sickness starts to cut
Mm,
in,
mhm.
and that's, you actually get sick from the low level of oxygen. So yeah, you definitely make some good points.
And also
Um,
with the age as well, looking at a number of different texts, like you were referring to the Vedic, the Yuga cycles, and how they're talking about not only were people bigger in certain periods, but they lived a lot longer. Well, if you go back to the biblical times and you look in the Old Testament, it talks about how people lived much longer. Back
yes,
then, hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's cross culturally. It's not just in one culture that this is
yes.
talked about. But what's so interesting is in different cultures with different religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, they have very similar things, that commonalities.
Okay. I could see that, and there was a number of points you had mentioned in your book, and this thing about the flood, and different cultures, and like the fact that there was some sort of an event where there was a flood, approximately, a lot of experts say approximately 12,000 years ago. People that look into this, you also, and this would be good for a lot of the people that might follow the podcast that are interested in the whole Anunnaki aspect. You actually went into a little bit of the fact that DNA was studied, from Stuart Fleischmann, from comparative genomics at the Swiss University. He studied the DNA of 9 pharaohs and found through PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction, Akhenaten, who was a Egyptian pharaoh, had a much higher CXPAC5, which is responsible for the growth of the cortex, a
Hmm.
possible genetic manipulation, high levels of telomerase and nucleotidic cicatricic So that's and you had mentioned that this is a possible signature of genetic manipulation, because I've kind of been curious about this before in my own research. And the reason why I've been curious about this is because there's been this missing link with what the classic academics say, hey, we evolved straight from monkeys. But yet,
Yeah.
when you look at how slow evolution is, and you look at the radical change in us, we're the anomaly. And I think other people have said this before, and I think I even heard Joe Rogan talk about this once. Like, there's we're the anomaly. Like the fact
Yes.
that like when we're born, we can't support our own heads. Our mothers have to basically hold us for the first. Like this is not something that commonly happens in the wild, because if an animal was built like us with a big head to support our big brains, they would be dead
Hmm.
before they got a chance to do anything, because we have, it's like we have to have somebody take care of us for the first X amount of time of our lives,
Yes.
because we can't even support our own heads. Our like if you pick a baby up, the heads are so much
So true.
proportionately bigger, and the neck's not strong enough to support it. So it's like it leads you to believe what happened if this what's uh the cortex explosion, some people were calling it. There was a term they were saying, but like 55 to 60,000 years ago, like all of a sudden, like the cerebral cortex of like the beings that were here that were the hominids grew, which is the forward thinking part of our critical
Hmm.
thinking part of our brain, by like what, like 30-40% in a matter of like almost the blink of an eye. And like
Yeah.
if you look at as far as evolution goes, there's no real answer in evolution for how fast. Evolution is a very slow process,
Yes.
almost like begrudgingly or grindingly slow. So to say
Hmm.
that like the brain grew that fast in that short of a time, like leads us to believe that maybe something else, like maybe there was another hand at play. Like you talk
Mm.
about Marduk or a Nibiru, if you want to talk about that, because I know a lot of people who are interested in these sorts of topics are interested in Zechariah Sitchin and
Sure.
Anunnaki, and if you have
Yeah.
anything to add to that.
Well, I just like I was saying, JP, it fascinates me. You have these different cultures that talk about very similar things. And when I started researching the Nephilim from a biblical perspective, and then also looking at the ancient Sumerian civilization and what they talked about, the Anunnaki and the giants, to me, there were so many things that were similar. How these beings were giant, how they came from the sky, how they brought knowledge to the people,
Yeah,
and also too there seems to be genetic manipulation in both stories, right? In the biblical story, it talks about how these sons of God went into the daughters of men,
yeah,
and on the Anunnaki side, it's their belief is that the Anunnaki took some of their DNA and
yeah.
mixed it with the primitive hominids that were on the planet at this time, and they intermixed them to basically create us. That was their belief, that they believed that they were the Anunnaki were, they created us,
For some sort
to
of
make
workers cast, like a cast of
workers.
workers
Yeah,
for
yeah.
them,
They
like we
needed
were
us
created.
more intelligent to do the work that they required. They
Yeah,
couldn't just go and use these primitive hominids that were on the planet at the time. So, yeah, there's so many similarities, and I do find it fascinating with the whole Sumerian side of the Anunnaki. There's a lot to that story. I'm doing some research now into that area as far as the Nephilim connection with the Anunnaki,
yeah.
and that's a deep rabbit hole that I just really
Okay.
started to go down.
Yeah, maybe we'll save that. I mean, have you had any glimmer of hope to find that there's been evidence of some sort of giant skulls being found in that area, and in like Mesopotamia and that area, and Sumer, like
Yeah,
where would this
not
exactly be today?
yeah, not so much yet as far as evidence of skulls being found in that area. However, the researcher that I'm looking at his research, talking about how some of these Anunnaki were very much like shamans.
Oh,
They were shamans, and so he's kind of coming at it from a different perspective, and he talks about Gilgamesh. I don't know if you heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the
yes.
ancient epic, and I talk about that in my book as well, the story of Gilgamesh, and he was one of the first Sumerian kings, and he was really kind of cruel. He was a mighty man. He was a warrior, and you'll see depictions of him as this large, muscular man, and he's holding one arm like this, and he's got a lion, like he's
Huh.
got it in a headlock, and
Yes.
it looks like it's just like a little like this little creature to him. He's so large, and he's just got this
Wow.
lion around the head. And
Yeah.
supposedly Gilgamesh was part human and part Anunnaki. His father
Wow.
was human, and his mother was one of these Anunnaki. And you'll hear this theme throughout history, like the ancient Greeks, the heroes being part god and part human.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, I even saw that with what we had spoken about before. Hard to believe that these men, one of them was, this looks like maybe one of the descendants of Goliath. I know he had Rapha and Goth were brothers of Goliath, and one of these men, I don't know if it was also a brother, Ishbi-Benob, had a spear tip that weighed 300 shekels, 7.5 pounds. And if you think about a spear, like we were talking before about a hatchet, think about a spear. A spear is like what you'll commonly see, like like the Aborigines or like natives throwing a spear, which has to be very aerodynamic. So you would imagine a spear tip, like an average spear tip, to be like, maybe like what if you had to take a spear tip off a spear, like a functional spear, a piece of wood that might weigh, I don't know, like maybe a pound, and maybe 5 feet long, and at the tip is going to be some sort of a hardened spear tip. That tip couldn't weigh on a functional spear that Uriah would hold if you had to weigh it. Certainly under a pound. I'd say maybe what, 2.5 ounces, 3 ounces for a spear tip
Yeah.
tops. And that would be anything bigger than that would start to become like unwieldy. Now we're talking a 7.5 pound spear tip. I mean, imagine having to pick up a weight that's 7.5 pounds and put that at the end of a pole big enough to support that weight, and then throw that. You or I would probably get off about a foot before it just hit the ground. So completely unfunctional. So it's a
Goliath's
wild to
spear
think about.
point. Goliath's spear point was 15 pounds.
50 pounds, yes, and you said that Goliath
15.
spear tip, 600 shekels. So, and then you were saying that these men had 6 fingers on their hands and toes. So
Yeah.
it's it's fascinating to think about that. These from evidence that you found, because some of the skulls with the double rows of teeth
Hmm.
support that this is not just some sort of biblical story, that these people were actually real.
Well,
And
what's fascinating, JP, when you're referencing that, like with the double rows of teeth and the extra fingers, is that it's so unusual. Like reading through the Bible, like why would they put in such an unusual reference, right?
yeah,
When they're talking about giants, why would they indicate that he had a double row of teeth and six
yeah,
fingers?
that's that's a very obscure reference.
It is.
That would be like, you know, it would almost be like if you were doing some sort of an investigation, like a murder investigation, and
Mhm.
then somebody said something like, let's say somebody was found near like an apothecary or an auditorium, like somewhere where it's like not commonly, and somebody had said, oh well, yeah, when you said it was by the apothecary, and I'd be like, I never said that.
Mm.
You said that.
Mhm.
I never said a word about the person being found near that location.
Mm.
So that's very interesting that you would say something like that, isn't it? Now,
Mm.
because how many people speak about somebody being found at a specific location? You know what I'm saying? It's almost
Yeah.
like a tell in the fact that, like, double rows of teeth. Like, I wouldn't have even known there was double rows of teeth that existed, and I didn't even really know this before this book. This is like something probably not common to a lot of people. You would think that this is like something of myths and legends, that like there's a giant with double rows of teeth, these people with 6 fingers,
Yes.
like this can't be real. And it's like, well, it was mentioned in the Bible, and you're actually you found a skull with this sort of
Yes.
anomaly.
And here's another thing, JP. In Utah, there's these petroglyphs of the Native Americans created, and they have these like a regular sized person, and then they have next to it like a person maybe 3 or 4 times that size. And then if you look at their hands, can you guess how many digits they included on the hands of the big one?
I would say 6 digits, right?
You got it. And the
Yeah,
smaller person, they had five, but
there
they
you
had this
go.
bigger person, they had six.
And you had found a tribe that exists to this day, which has an extreme higher rate of the extra digit and the hyperdontorism, or whatever
Yes,
this was
it's
called.
it's in South America, the Wairani tribe. Yeah,
Yep.
there is higher incidences of not only the double rows of teeth, but the extra digits as well. And that particular tribe, a lot of the males, a high percentage of them actually die from intertribal violence. There's a
Because they're
lot of
extremely violent.
extremely
Wow.
violent. Now they don't have giants, they're not a giant people, but I just thought it was very fascinating that they have other genetic traits of these.
Yes.
We hear about the giants, as far as the
Yes.
level of violence, the double rows of teeth, and the extra digits on the hands. I thought that was very interesting.
That that would be very interesting to look into for some sort of a DNA test.
Yes.
And that was one thing before I'll just ask you about maybe some on the opposite side of the spectrum before we wrap it up. I know you were talked a little bit about pygmies and small people to show that there's
Yeah.
like the opposite side of the spectrum that exists. And then
Yeah.
while it's still in my mind, because I just thought of this now,
Mhm.
um, back to that um, three-fingered reptoid creature that was found near the what was it? Atacama, Peru, near the Nazca lines.
Your
I get like
Nazca lines, yeah.
I was looking for a nickname of her. It was a female nickname.
Maria.
Yeah.
Maria.
Oh, okay. So check this out. I just had something to throw at you. This is like food for thought.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this when I read the book, and I wanted to make sure that before we did our interview, because like I said, we'll wrap it up in a couple minutes,
Yeah.
and we'll you were saying it's something like 23.5% human, and then like whatever the remaining percent, that would be like what, like 73 point, like whatever the rest of that percentage would be
Yeah.
unclassified. So an
Hmm.
unknown DNA from this hominid, and clearly has large eyes, three fingers, three toes,
Yeah.
an Achilles tendon that doesn't connect the same way arcus. So obviously some sort of other type of creature unknown that this
Hmm.
person was, or whatever this was. And I think this is food for thought. Like, we're saying 23.5% human. What if we're 23.5% that? And because we all generally share common DNA now, we just consider ourselves human. And then,
Mm.
we're 75% something else. Like, how do we know? Like, what I'm saying? Like, at
That's a
some level,
great
that
point.
being is just that being, and that we don't share. You know what I'm saying? Because it could be the flip.
Mhm.
It could be the other way around. Like, and I've always wondered that, because
Mm.
I, I'm at the point where I don't pull any punches. I'm not 50%. I'm not 40%. I'm effectively almost like 100%. If you even like held a gun to my head, I would say that I believe that, like the talk of these crash retrievals from UFOs is a real thing, and that um, there's been recovery of not only craft but also biologics, and I've kind of come across that across my research across the years. So one of my big questions was always like, what would the DNA test yield of these bodies? Because I know they've been done. It's just the information's been withheld. And I think there's a possibility that this information has been withheld because it could be so shattering to our
Yes.
fundamental nature of who we are. Because what if the
Mm.
answer to this DNA test, like what if they took the beings from Roswell that they have in the cryogenic storage right now, and they pull and they do a DNA test from them, and they find out
Mm.
like, hey, there's like a 60% match on our DNA with these
Mm.
beings. Now,
Mm.
we're clearly going to say we know these beings weren't from planet Earth because they came in these craft that weren't manufactured
Mm.
here. We know that for a
Mhm.
fact. So if we
Mm.
share whatever percent DNA with them, it begs the question, do we share, do they share DNA with us, or do we share? They were the original ones, and part of our DNA is their DNA. So, like, I
Mm.
think there's a strong possibility that something like that could come up, and that would be very, like shattering, like as far as like like very kind of like disabling and like paradigm shifting for how
Hmm.
we view ourselves. I don't know, maybe in a good way and a bad way, but like some people in a good way, some people in a bad way. But like, I'm saying like these are heavy questions that we're
Yeah.
asking here, and this is maybe a reason why some of these things are being ignored, because it's a lot easier just look the other way and have to admit this massive 800-pound gorilla in the room or whatever. So
Yeah, some very, very interesting food for thought there, JP. And we
and
do know, our ancient ancestors. We kind of touched on that briefly. The Denisovans were interbreeding with Neanderthal and with
yes,
our ancient ancestors. We know that many of us have Neanderthal DNA in us. In fact, most of us do. Most of us do have Neanderthal DNA. And now that they've
wow,
discovered this new genome of the Denisovans out of Siberia, now they're finding Denisovan DNA in certain populations,
okay,
particularly
wow,
Native American. They're finding some in Native American, some over in Europe, and some over in Papua New Guinea. They
yeah.
found people over there have this Denisovan DNA.
Very cool. That the more we look for it, if we're not looking for the right things, we're not going to find it. But if we start
Hmm.
asking the critical questions and looking for the things that we need to look for, I believe a lot of the answers that we seek are already here, and it's
Mm.
just a matter of either getting to the bottom of them or getting them unclassified or getting to speak to the right people.
Hmm.
So before we wrap this up, I just wanted to ask you two more questions.
Sure.
One would be about the pygmies, and I don't want to go because you went into a whole different type. I'm just going to give you an example, and then
Hmm.
like anything else you might want to add to this interview
Sure.
that you want to talk
Yeah.
about that you didn't already get to speak about. But
Mhm.
I'm just going to just throw one fact at you, and
Sure.
I'll just kind of let you, um, you know. Rock with it. So in
Okay.
2003, there was a team of Australian and Indonesian archaeologists and paleontologists that were digging in Liang Bua Cave,
Hmm.
and they found a 3 foot tall skeleton, and Thomas Sutkna headed the excavation, and eventually the skeleton was found to be 60 to 100,000 years old, called Homo floresiensis.
Yeah.
Another cave yielded similar results of a hobbit type creature, but that was 700,000 years old, and there were stone tools nearby that dated to almost a million years old, and they could make advanced tools, utilize fire, hunt large prey. There was a number of other smaller hobbits. One was in Luzon, Philippines, called the Homo luzonensis, dated to about 50,000 years. And scientist Robert Burkar Bednarik tested to see if he could sail from the main land of Komodo Island using a raft and dried bamboo. They lashed together some jungle vines, sealed it with some tree sap, and they found out that it is possible that 800,000 years ago that our ancestors could have figured this out, or some ancient of our ancestors. So, and there was also one more thing, that there was talk of another hobbit called the Ibu Gogo, which became a
Yeah.
pest to local villagers, and they wind up kidnapping some of the local villagers' children. So they eventually conquered the Ibu Gogo and then burned the cave. So, like I said, anything you want to add to that about hobbits, and anything
Yeah.
else you want to add about your research
Absolutely.
that you'd like to speak
Yeah,
about?
it's a fascinating subject, JP, and I stumbled on it when I was doing my research on the giants, looking at old newspaper articles. I came across references in North America of these little pygmy skeletons being discovered, particularly in the area of Tennessee. And there's a rich Native American tradition amongst the Cherokee people of these little people. They were small. They were not more than 3 feet tall. Some of them were violent, and the native
Wow.
peoples fought with them and eventually wiped them out. Just about in every Native American tribe, they'll have some type of reference to little people, and also
Wow.
giants as well, which I find interesting.
Yeah.
Now, in the early 2000s, as you mentioned, on the Isle of Flores, they found this whole new race, this whole new species that they called the Flores hobbits, and I have one of the little skulls right here. This is a replica of the one of the first skulls that they found. It's just
Ooh,
a little skull, and they
look at
first thought
that.
it was like the skull of a child until
Yeah.
they looked at the teeth and they found that it had the wisdom teeth. And
Wow.
yeah, and it raised a lot of controversy amongst archaeologists and paleontologists because they were like, well, maybe it had a disease, and that's why it was so small. And
Yeah.
after extensive testing, and then they found other skeletons, other bones, they determined no, this isn't from a disease. This race of people, they were not much more than 3 feet tall,
Yeah.
and they were intelligent. They knew how to make fire. They knew how to make
Look at that.
tools. Yeah, and they hunted Komodo dragons. They found Komodo dragon skeletons in this giant
Wow.
cave, which indicated they might have been hunting them, which is
Yeah.
pretty amazing. How be 3 feet tall and grab your little spear and go out and try to kill one of these giant Komodo dragons, which
And they're
still
scary.
exist. They're
And
scary.
Komodo dragons are scary for you and I because I heard if a
Oh,
Komodo dragon bites you, they have
yeah,
like a plethora
poisonous.
of all sorts of deadly bacteria in their mouth. So
Yes,
they'll usually bite like a cow or something, then they'll
yeah,
follow it for like a week and they'll wait for the cow to succumb to infection and just die because they have like all this bacteria
absolutely.
on their mouth.
Yeah, yeah. So I definitely believe these little people were real. I believe there was much more diversity on our planet
Yeah.
than we've been led to believe, and I believe as more excavations happen, and hopefully, if this information is given to the public, we'll come to see just how diverse this world is. And I have, this is one of the replica skulls from Peru. This is one of the elongated skulls.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, look
And
at the
and
look at the length of that.
and we're talking that these skulls actually have a larger capacity. They're not just elongated
That's
skulls.
right.
So they have 30%, just like I said, 50,000 years ago, whatever the hominids were became us with the larger brain capacity. These skulls, you could say, oh, well, they were artificially binded. Well, if you artificially just bound a skull, it would still have the same capacity, but just different shape. But
Yeah.
these skulls, they have a larger, 30% larger cerebral capacity. I don't know if that would be like the cortex area that's bigger or just the skull overall, but like it shows that it's something different. That the fact
Yes.
that this isn't artificially created, that the skull has a larger volume, because you cannot create that by binding, and that's a very
That's a great point, and obviously not all elongated skulls fall into that category. However, there are some, like you mentioned, that you can't explain. You can't
yeah
explain, like, that they strapped a board to their head when they were a child to elongate it. It doesn't explain the fact, like you said, with the brain capacity, the brain size, and also a number of sutures on the back of their skulls are
yes
different than Homo sapiens. So even
yes
if it was artificially elongated, they should still have the same number of sutures as a
yeah the
Homo
plates that make
sapien.
the skull
Yeah,
together for
precisely,
sure.
precisely. This is a skull of a Denisovan. This was a replica that was of an original that was recently brought forth out of China, that was found in the 1930s and hidden in a well until the man that found it was on his deathbed, and he revealed it to his kids. He said, "Go to the well, and this is where you find the skull." And then they tested it and determined, based on other remains of the Denisovans they found in 2010 in Siberia, that this skull is a Denisovan skull. And many
Wow,
researchers say that average height of the Denisovans was 7.5 feet tall.
look at that, and look at the size of those eyes.
Yeah, look at the size of the eyes. Now, can you imagine a massive jawbone attached to this?
Yeah, that's a
Huge.
huge head.
It's
Yep.
a huge head, a huge head. So, yeah, I believe our planet is so much more diverse, and I believe
Yeah.
there were many different types of species. I believe there were giants. I believe that there were these little people, these beings in South America that have the three fingers, elongated heads, and are so different from us. Some of them have reptilian features. Some of
Yeah.
them look like a hybrid between a Homo sapien and a reptile. Others
You had those
appear.
little classic looking ETs. They had almost from the
Yeah,
movie ET. You had mummies found that looked just like that being.
absolutely. And I'm sure you've probably heard in the Mexican Congress recently, one of the mummies was taken before the Mexican Congress,
Yes.
and it brought up it raised a lot of hell. And a lot of people are saying, laughing at it and going, "Oh, that's fake, that's fake." But they did bone scans on it, and they basically, the researchers said, "Well, I don't know if it's alien or not, but it doesn't look like these are animal bones and human bones mixed. It looks like one skeletal structure to it."
Yeah. Was that the little one that because I know Stephen Greer did a whole documentary about it. It was like found near Atacama, Brazil, I think near the Nazca. It was little. It was only about that big.
I think this
And
is a different one. I know which
okay,
one
but
you're talking about.
there's
Yeah.
been a couple of them found, and they're
There's been a
so
couple of
strange.
them.
And a lot of people are like, "Oh, it had to be a fake. It had to be a mixture
Sure.
of like
Yeah.
human and animal
Yeah.
bones, and they wrap it in something, and like,
Yeah.
and they're doing these testing. They're like, well, no, you see all the sutures, and you see all the like the sinew and the bones being held together. And this looks
Yeah.
like a real biological being. Oh, well, then it had to be some sort of a baby that was abandoned. And they're like,
Yeah.
no, like there's some strange stuff going around this planet. Like we even had, I don't want to get too much into this because, like I said, we're about to,
Yeah.
I'll just let you like plug your book and such. But like, just to
Sure.
kind of give you an idea, I looked into maybe some of the weirdness that was going on in the Southwest here, and I don't know if you've ever heard like any speculation, maybe about a UFO base out in the area of the Archuleta Mesa, and there's just like
Mm.
a lot of weirdness going on out there.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of strange stuff.
There's cattle mutilations. One
Yeah.
of the state troopers, his name was Gabe Valdez. He wrote a book, and he wasn't maybe necessarily a proponent about the UFO base out there, but everybody has a right to their opinion. But he was a
Yeah.
state trooper out there, and he was investigating a lot of these cattle mutilations and the strangeness involving these black helicopters and all these cows turning up dead. And
Yeah.
in one of the cases, they found one of these cows afterwards, and he said it had some sort of a fetus that was like aborted next to the cow, and it was like, he
Really?
said it almost looked like human frog, like a
Mm.
cross between a human and a frog, but it was found near a dead cow, one of these
Wow.
mutilated cows. He
Mm.
said it was a fetus that almost looked like a reptilian frog human type creature.
That's
And it was
really
like the
interesting.
strangest thing. And you really couldn't explain this thing to say, no, it was just it was just a cow baby that was, disformed.
Yeah.
He said, no, he said it was some sort of strange, and like, how do you, that's like a complete X factor. So there's clearly some high strangeness going on out here with
Wow.
what's been going on this planet, with what's
Yeah.
going on to this day, and just everything. So it's
Go
great.
going
You know,
back to ancient times, JP,
yeah,
remember I was talking about in the book of Enoch, I was talking about they were mixing one type of animal with another type of
yes,
animal. And I think this stuff's been going on. You can go
yeah.
back thousands and thousands of years, and I think it's going on today.
And there was even talk that if you look into all that talk about maybe some find up in Antarctica within the past 20 years that they've been talking about. I don't know if you've heard anything about that, but I know one researcher, David Wilcock, had in one of his books that they actually found some antediluvian civilization under the ice out
Yeah, like
there. And
pyramids and things like that.
when they were extracting the bodies, he was saying that they were 13 feet tall. They had different
Wow.
symmetry between the arms and the joints, how tall the arms were.
Mhm.
He said there was possibly some signs of maybe them doing some genetic mutations or manipulations with the livestock or the animals or the mammoths.
Mm,
So like I said, I'm not getting into all that, but I did read a
sure.
book at some point, and references to this sort of thing were
I
mentioned.
have heard of that, yeah.
Do you have any website that you want to plug your book or plug any of your stuff at?
Yeah, absolutely. TheAncientGiants.com is my website. And on that website, I have a breakdown of my chapters in my book. It'll give you more information if you're interested in purchasing it. I am a self published author. And if you do decide to purchase my book, I'd encourage people to go to bookbaby.com. And my book is The Red Haired Giants of Lovelock Cave and Other Ancient Mysteries. And BookBaby is really supportive of self published authors. But I am on Amazon too. If you want to go to Amazon, my book is on there as well.
Great, great. And Book Baby, that might be an offshoot in the days of me being a musician 20 years ago. We had CD Baby, and you plugged
Oh,
your own albums there. So
okay.
it's probably
Yeah,
like maybe like the same company. But so it's great that you're a independent author. I
yeah.
commend you for being out there doing the work that needs to be done on this planet that a lot of people aren't covering in the mainstream media and mainstream researchers and archaeologists. So it's good that you have somebody like yourself out there trying to genuinely get to the bottom of mysteries that we know there's evidence that there's something a part of our story that's not being told, and you're telling that, which is great. I certainly appreciate you coming on Not Media, and like and subscribe Not Media if everybody watching like this, and tell your friends. Thank you, Floyd Wills, for coming on Not Media. When you come out with your next book, I would love to read it. I'd love to have you back on, and we will certainly be in touch, and we'll stay in touch about any sort of information I find on my end. So I appreciate you
absolutely,
coming on
JP.
again,
Thank,
Floyd.
thank you so much. And,
Great.
I appreciate the work that you're doing by giving people like myself a platform to share our
Yeah.
research and get the word out. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. And thanks to your audience for tuning in.
My pleasure. Great time talking with you. Have a nice evening,
Yeah.
Floyd.
You too. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for listening to this episode, and thank you everyone who has chosen a life of service. This is not just military, fire, police, and EMS, but also anyone who has taken their talents and passions and used them for the service and betterment of others and this world. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying until next time. This is your host, @NotMedia, JP signing off. Stay well, everyone.